All right, so this is what I was thinking. This is what I was thinking. If you can still hear me over the music, anyways. All right. I'm always trying to understand the underlying thought process behind what people think and do that goes beyond what might be even conscious for them. Like, for example, we have heard from the mouth of some who are more progressive that, and I'll get to your question here in a minute, Don. I want to make sure I can share some of my thoughts I've had recently. That because we have a tendency to absorb a philosophy or a zeitgeist, kind of the spirit of the age in which we live, we have a tendency to absorb underlying modern philosophical trends that impact the way we conceptualize things, the way we look at things, how skeptical we are of things, how whether or not we can really know a thing as it is in of itself and stuff, to look at the more Kantian epistemological skepticism, or the kind of the human. I'm thinking of Hume and his the uncertainty he even puts into what reason can comprehend by saying that not all effects even have a cause. Those kinds of things. All these kind of underlying philosophical things that give shape and mold to people they absorb. They just unconsciously absorb these things as we just grow up and interact relationally. And as a result, they're not always thought of explicitly. They're not always critiqued in the light of ideas that may be counter to it. All right. In one sense, I would agree that education helps to facilitate liberty, right? Because we have enough knowledge to break free from predominant paradigms, right? And this gives a certain amount of freedom to think and to reason and to assess what is being presented to us, right? So knowledge is a very, very good key, and that's one of the reasons that underlie the philosophy of liberal education, why it's so broad, because we learn a little bit about it, psychology, a little bit about sociology, math, science, and we can kind of draw a certain knowledge set, right? Well, anyways, there's this, you will find among some progressives that will make statements like logic is racist or math is racist. And I was thinking about how could they get to such a conception? And it made me think this too, along the lines of how some people would say that because European white men crafted our Constitution, therefore supporting our Constitution is inherently white supremacy. Now, one of the things I began to think of, how can I make sense out of this? All right. Yeah, they can just make these statements, but how would we ground this in reality in some way? And what's interesting is that if they conceptualize the human person through the prism of naturalism, right? So the consciousness is just a product of an epiphenomenon of like the material structure, the material composition of the brain, the physical structures, the neural pathways, right? The chemical interactions, the electrical impulses, and this constitutes the whole of what we experience as consciousness as a human person. They would have to conceptualize it this way metaphysically, right? This is what they would have to say about human consciousness and intellect and will, and all of that would be inherent in material itself, which is not the Aristotelian Catholic perception. Well, if that's true, then maybe they could then reason that a certain degree of determinism, because I don't necessarily experience or determine how exactly chemicals interact with each other, which is a set science, or how material structure, material composition. I can't change the material composition of my brain. There would be some debate as to exactly whether or not the physical structures, that constitute, like certain neural pathways and stuff may or may not be something that I could will or change or modify. But at some level, all of this stuff is more about physics and chemical interaction and a set structure of things I don't have any control over whatsoever, that it's more deterministic. And I wonder, at some level, they think that somehow one's genetics naturally predispose them to certain behaviors, such as a strict behavior, exactness, versus maybe a more laid back, broad kind of approach to things. If they're somehow then saying, well, the white European man is genetically predisposed to have the predisposition for exactness, and so therefore they're going to conceptualize logic and reason and discipline and these other things, to the point that certain other gene pools who might live in a society that's structured by those ideas would be at some sort of disadvantage because they're predisposed contrary to that. The only thing I can possibly think of, because some of these progressive teachers would make some sort of argument to say that, like math is racist or being on time is racist. That's just a white idea. Like, how do they get to that if they don't ground it into some sort of genetics, right? What makes it distinctively, just because a certain idea might be found among a certain culture that might have a certain genetics, are they therefore saying that genetics is that society or culture is a mere overflow of genetic predispositions, and therefore the ideas that are predominant in a certain culture is because of the predominant gene pools, and therefore if those ideas over structure a society overall is going to be racist against people who come from gene pools who have predominantly have different dispositions. Of course, there's no way to win this, because even if you switched it, right? So even if in this conception of things, which I totally disagree with, and I'm not saying that there isn't a measure of truth to some of the things that I'm saying, but I don't think that's the whole picture. Even if you were to change society to a way that's contrary to the culture that it is now you have the exact same problem. You have a people group with a genetic dispositions that's contrary to the kind of culture in which it's being forced upon them, if that is the way they want to conceptualize things, which I think is incredibly dangerous because it leads to eugenics and all of that other stuff. And it has, in fact, led to those sorts of things, That's why communism in general doesn't work, because there's just too much variety in human life that it can't be put into a neat little package so that everybody will just fit perfectly within it. That's not going to work.